Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. We're up to Unit 3 today, and we're going to look at feedback. And obviously, leading remotely, feedback does provide some challenges because clearly you're not there at the time. So it's hard to give feedback to people when you're working remotely. So obviously, I'm going to cover that topic. And I did touch on this briefly, I guess, in our first session and the importance of it. Most people would argue that they don't get enough feedback anyway, even in a normal environment, in a normal working environment. So it does present more challenges for people remotely. So let's have a look at that today. I'll just share my screen and then we'll launch into the topic. Now, what I wanted to talk about here is you can see that we're up to Unit 3, and I did spend a bit of time, and it was only a week ago, and I hope that hasn't messed people around too much, but we did look at the GROW model, and I hope you've had a chance to try GROW between last time we spoke and today. And I would encourage you to use it. And of course, it's a great tool to use, whether it's remote or otherwise, to be honest, because it does get the other person to take accountability for their own what they're proposing to do and to give them a chance to think through what they need to think through. So your homework was obviously to practice that and to give that a shot. So I hope you had a chance to do that. And I'm always open, of course, to your feedback and would welcome it. All right, let's move on to today's topic. And I really want to cover three things today. I want to look at just basically setting the scene in relation to feedback, just some general principles, a little bit of research about it, and just talk about why it's so important. And I'm sure you're aware it's important, and it might well be that you're not receiving excuse me, you're not receiving much feedback, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't be giving feedback. So we'll look at that. I want to talk about some of the key principles in giving feedback and just really consider those from the challenges of working remotely. And probably the most difficult of all is difficult feedback. That is feedback that's not positive. We might call it constructive feedback, but it's often quite difficult to give, and it can create some challenges for us. So we'll look at difficult feedback as well. Okay, so three key things today. So the first thing I wanted to do was share this quote because I think really it encapsulates a lot of the problem. And that is, if annual reviews are the only time when feedback is given, that's a problem. Because it's certainly better than nothing. So, I mean, obviously, if people are getting feedback at their performance review time, if you're still using performance reviews, then I guess it's better than nothing. But I think one of the problems with the performance review, of course, is that we tend to save up all our feedback for the performance review, and we don't bother to give it to people at the right time. And I think that's problematic. So I certainly would encourage you to start giving more feedback. And of course, you might be saying, how do I do that if I'm not physically in the same room? And that's, of course, what we're going to talk about today. Now, before we go any further, here's some sobering statistics that I just wanted to share with you, some information. This comes from Deloitte's work, and it does just highlight how critically important it is for us to be giving regular feedback. 60% of employees don't understand what the organization's goals are, which is incredible, isn't it? That only 40% do, in other words. And I guess that can be even more problematic when we're working remotely. And the reason for that is that people often don't get told things or get told things after the event. And so if there is a change in direction or if something's moving in a different direction, then sometimes people working remotely are the last to find out about it. 87% of employees aren't engaged in the work they do, which is staggering. I've seen statistics that suggest 70%, but it's more than 50, I know that. So people are disengaged at work. And of course, we know what that looks like. But I think what's more disturbing is that 20% are actively undermining the value of other people. Now, I guess from a remote environment, you might think, well, surely that would not be quite so problematic. But of course, people have still got access to telephones and technology, and they'll still have their little discussions with people. And so I still think that's an issue. 77% of employees say that performance would improve with more feedback. Giving feedback increases engagement by 60%. So basically, people are saying, that is, the people that you lead, perhaps, are saying, we want more feedback. And I think, the message is loud and clear there. 50% of managers fail to hold their team members accountable and have the hard conversation. And that's very true from my own experience, that I find a lot of managers are very reluctant to have the difficult conversation. In fact, they might argue, let sleeping dogs lie, or don't open up a can of worms. So they don't bother to have these conversations that they should be having with people. And I think that's really problematic. So my suggestion is you need to have those conversations, regardless of whether you're working in an office or whether you're working remotely. Strangely enough, it's sometimes easier to have those difficult conversations via Zoom or one of the other technologies than it might be face-to-face. And I'm not quite sure why that's the case, but that's been the feedback that I've received. And finally, 57% of employees say that they want more critical feedback that helps them improve their performance. So here again, employees are now saying, we want more feedback, but they don't get the feedback that they necessarily want. So I guess what I'm doing here is just setting the scene and just say to you that it is extremely important that we should be giving feedback. And I believe it's important to give feedback even in a remote environment, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. So that's sort of setting the scene, if you like. So if we go back to my slides and move on, whoops, went too far there. Let's just go back one slide. Now, this is an interesting graph because you can see that the greeny blue color there is positive and the red is negative. And if you look at the top, on the top bar, it says if people only receive strength-based feedback, that is positive feedback. So if you're used to only giving positive feedback to people, it's likely that you'll have a reasonably engaged bunch of employees, right? So it's obviously a good thing. It's better than no feedback. That's the point. Now, interesting enough, it gets more and more interesting because in the second bar there, if you only receive critical feedback, or if you give critical feedback, in other words, you don't give positive praise and positive reinforcement and positive feedback, interestingly enough, you still have a reasonably engaged workforce, all things being equal, of course. But the bottom bar is the telling bar, because if you don't give any feedback, positive or constructive, you will undoubtedly contribute to disengaging your team members. In other words, there's a high correlation between engagement levels and feedback. That's my point. So engaging your people via feedback is critically important. That's the key message that I'd want to get through here today. All right. So let me have a look at a couple of other dimensions around feedback before we launch into some of the things that you should be mindful of when you're giving feedback remotely. So roughly by a 3-to-1 margin, employees believe constructive feedback does more to improve performance than positive feedback. So basically, people are saying in survey after survey after survey, we want more feedback and we don't mind negative feedback because it lets us know where the line in the sand is. So we're getting these signals that people want to know where they stand, and I think that's fair. Now, the trouble is, of course, is the secret to having your people listen to your feedback is whether or not they respect you. And that is a critically important denominator. So respect is earned. It's incredibly hard to get, and it requires a degree of authenticity. Now, the truth of the matter is, if you give the same feedback to two people who've done exactly the same thing, it's likely that one may take it on board and the other one doesn't. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is that one may respect you and the other one may not. And so therefore, respect is critically important. And I'm hoping through this Lunch and Learn series that we're giving you some tips on being more authentic. And remember, by authentic, I'm not talking about some technique. I'm talking about being yourself, showing your vulnerabilities, being humble, letting people know sometimes that you don't know the answer to something. Those sorts of qualities are extremely important. And if people can come across that way, that when you, in fact, do give feedback, it's likely that it'll land. In other words, the person will be likely to accept it. And I think that's very, very important in the whole equation. Now, you might recall in the very first session, I ran through 7 questions around managing expectations. I want to revisit those questions because I think working remotely, it's extremely important that we get an answer, a yes answer to each of these. Let's have a look. The first question is, are you clear of the expectations, your expectations as a leader? Now, when you're working with people remotely, of course, the expectations are not so much process driven, but more outcome driven. So in other words, by the end of today, if you expect a report to be written, then that's an expectation that's a reasonable one that you obviously have of someone else. Now, how they go about that, it's a little more difficult to manage because, of course, they're working from home. So, of course, you've got to know what your expectations are as a leader. I'm assuming you do know what those expectations are. And of course, the second key question is, have you communicated those expectations to your team members? Now, I don't mean once either. I mean several times. And you need to communicate those expectations moment by moment, situation by situation, and so forth, because people need to see a consistency in your expectations. So, of course, you can have those expectations, but if you haven't communicated them, that's a problem. And then the next problem is, do your team members actually understand your expectations? Now, the expectations that you have of people may be perfectly logical, but it may not be to the recipient. So do they understand? Do they understand the why you have an expectation? So if you have a report that's supposed to be written by the close of business today, have you explained why that's important so that they understand why you have that expectation? Because bear in mind, the other person's probably got 10 or 15 different things to do anyway. And why should your report be more important than anything else? Well, unless you explain the expectations to other people, then it may go to the bottom of the list and you might be very disappointed at the end of the day and find that the person hasn't started it yet, let alone completed it. Do your team members accept your expectations? So it's important that you get some buy-in around this. And people often nod, but they don't really. And of course, we just assume that our expectations are accepted. Now, of course, if someone doesn't accept your expectations, the chances of them doing it or meeting those expectations are not high. And then are your team members committed to meeting those expectations? And as I said to you in our very first session together several weeks ago, it is important for you to ask for people's commitment. So you can do this online. Just ask people, just say to people, can I get your commitment to get this report finished by the close of business today? Now, that's an important question because that is what you want. And it's nothing discourteous to ask for that commitment. In fact, it's quite courteous because you're making it very clear what you expect of the other person. Now, what you're waiting for, of course, if you ask that question is a nod, a grunt, or a yes. you want people to respond positively to that. Now, if they do, then it's likely that the chances of them meeting your expectations will go up significantly. Why? Because people have put their word on the line. Now, of course, if they and ah and they can't meet those expectations, then you have a whole new set of conversations around why not? What's getting in the way? All right. So both of those. So it's a great question to open up a conversation about meeting an expectation and getting a commitment about that expectation. Now, do your team members know how they're performing against their expectation? Now, this is what we call feedback. And of course, you need to be giving regular feedback, because if you don't do that, then people actually don't know whether or not they're meeting your expectations. They might guess, but they don't know for sure. So giving feedback is critically important. Now, the other side of things is, are you supporting your team members to meet those expectations? Are you removing roadblocks in the organization? You know, when we're working remotely, often stakeholders are out of sight and out of mind. And because they're out of sight and out of mind, often the communication breakdowns occur between different sections of a business. And it might be your job to try and mend some bridges or get some cooperation from another team. And that would be something that I believe would be critically important to supporting people to meet your expectations. So, for example, coming back to this issue of writing the report, if the person is waiting for information from someone else in another team in the organization, and this person who is to supply the information is dragging their heels, then it may well be appropriate for you to contact their team leader and make sure that they are aware of the importance of getting that information to your team member on time. So that would be a way that you could support your team members to meet those expectations. Okay, so I'll just stop sharing for a moment. So you can see that expectations are critically important. And you can also see that one of the key things is actually around giving feedback. That is part of the framework of expectations. Let's now look at some of the things that you need to do in order to get the very best from the people you lead. Whoops, I didn't share, just a moment. Let me share screen. Okay, let me go back one. Yeah. So here are some general principles, and let me talk about it in the context of remote working. So timing is critically important, and timing means that the sooner you give people feedback about something, the better. And you probably realize that, because if you give feedback to someone very early in the piece, as early as you can, and this is a challenge leading remotely, if you do that, then of course the person gets a very clear signal that your feedback is critically important, because you have decided to make it a priority, because you've jumped in as quickly as possible. So we're all busy people, and there's probably a myriad of things that you could be doing. But I think if you need to give feedback to someone, it's really important to do it as quickly as possible after the incident or whatever it is that you want to give the feedback about. So timing's important. Now, of course, this is not so easy when you're working remotely, but if you get some indications or some signals that something's not quite right, in terms of one of your team members and what they're working on or whatever, then you should get on the phone immediately, or at least, via a Zoom call or whatever is required, and to start to find out what's going on. Because the longer you leave it, of course, first of all, the more damage is likely. But secondly, the longer you leave it, the more the other person thinks that your feedback is not important, because they might rationalize that if it was really that important, wouldn't you be giving that to me immediately? So I see people do this in performance reviews, for example. They say, well, look, what you did 6 months ago was great. And the other person's thinking to themselves, well, if it was really that great, why wouldn't you have given me that feedback 6 months ago? So it loses its impact if you delay it too long. Now, of course, with negative feedback, we'd probably feel uncomfortable about giving it. But leaving it and delaying it and finding an excuse not to give it at the time is actually not helpful for you nor the other person. So you need to get in as quickly as possible. And it's the same with positive feedback as well. Now, the second key principle out of feedback is that you need to be very specific about your feedback. So no generalities, and I'll give you an example in a minute of what I mean by generality. But at the end of the day, the feedback is on the behavior, not the person. So don't personalize it. So for example, if somebody's got you notice that their attitude could improve, it's no good giving them feedback to say that your attitude is no good. Because if you do that, you're attacking the person. You might think, well, I believe that, but the truth is you want the person to actually accept the feedback and do something about it. So you might be better off saying to the other person, look, the last 3 things that you contributed to in the team meeting were basically negative. And I want to encourage you to change that around and inject the odd positive comment. All right. Now, they might not like that, but it's more behavioral than personal. And that's the point I'm making. And you'll notice that it's more specific, as in I'm talking about 3 critical incidents or examples. Let's have a look at an example and show you what I mean. Let's imagine that you got this feedback. All right. So someone said, good job on the online presentation at this morning's meeting. So somebody had to give a presentation at your morning online meeting. But you said to them, overall, good job on the presentation this morning online, but it could have been better. Now, what do you think you're going to think? I mean, if someone gave you that feedback, would you not think, my goodness, what have I done wrong? Isn't that what you'd think? Because that last bit says, but it could have been better. Because it's too vague, it's too general, it's not specific enough. And so therefore the person's wondering what it is. The other thing is, of course, about that feedback, when you say good job overall, what in heaven's name do you mean? Was there something that you liked in the presentation that you could comment on? Here's a better way of giving that feedback. What about if you said this? Great job on the online presentation. I really like how you use statistics to back up your key points. Right? Now, I know, if you're giving me that feedback, I know what you liked about my presentation. You liked the fact that I used statistics to back up my points. And you also added in your comment, one small comment, maybe for next time, would be to invite more comments from the group to get them more involved. Okay, now we're going somewhere. And, if you gave me that feedback, I would probably think to myself, you know what, I'd probably say, yeah, you're right. I was a bit nervous using the technology online and I wasn't quite sure which buttons to click. And I decided, I realized that I probably should have asked more questions and got people more engaged. So I'm agreeing with you. And so you're likely that specific feedback is going to hit the mark. So what have we got to so far? We're talking about timing and we're talking about being specific. What's the next thing? Frequency. So what it means is that you need to be giving regular feedback, moment by moment, project by project, situation by situation, meeting by meeting, constant feedback. And of course, as we know, there's positive and constructive feedback. So getting a blend between the two is critically important. And what I suggest is, if this is a challenge for you, then just start by giving positive feedback to start with. Just do that for 2 weeks and see what happens. You'll be very surprised at what it will do for your working relationships with people, how you feel about yourself, and perhaps even productivity, just by giving positive feedback. So give it a go. So I have encouraged you to have one-on-ones with your team members online. I think that's critically important in the climate we're living in, the world we're in at the moment. I think it's very important for a number of reasons. But you have got regular check-ins, and at each of those check-ins, there are opportunities for you, of course, to give feedback, and I would urge you to take those opportunities. You could also ask for feedback as well for you. And don't be afraid to ask for it. And if you receive it and it's not flattering, then don't get upset. Say to the other person, thanks for the feedback. Let me just process that and I'll get back to you. That's perfectly fine. And it gives you a breathing space to actually think about that feedback. And sometimes, of course, as you know, we hear feedback differently as time passes. So we might initially be defensive, and then after a little bit of a while, we end up understanding what it all means. Not always, but sometimes that's the case. So we've got timing, we've got being specific, and we've got the frequency. So these are the three key things. Let's look at some more. The other thing about feedback that I think is extremely important is you need to ask questions. Remember, leaders are in the business of asking questions, not answering questions. And what that means is that you've got to get used to asking open-ended questions. Why, what, who, where, how, and which. If you ask those sorts of questions online, you will get more than a one-word answer. So where did you hear this? What was the feedback you got? Why did that happen? How can I help? Which team are you referring to? So all of those questions allow the other person to contribute, and because they can contribute, you're going to find that works really well. Now, I know there's some of you that work a lot with clients and customers. Same deal. When you're in a meeting with a client or a customer, regardless of whether it's online or face-to-face, you should be prepared to ask a lot of open-ended questions and sit back and listen to what's being said. You'll get a far better meeting doing it that way. So I believe feedback is all about you asking questions. And at the end of this presentation, I've got a little 3 questions to ask people for feedback. So that's important. Ask questions. And of course, in this environment we're working in, you can say to people, look, I don't know. Obviously, I'm not there. I don't know for sure. Can you tell me a little bit about what's happening with, stakeholder X or whatever, and just sit back and listen to what has to be said. All right, so we've got the importance of giving immediate feedback. We've talked about being very specific. We have talked about talking about what was that last one? I forgot. Yeah, questions. And now I think privacy is important. So what I'm suggesting here online is that you don't want to be giving people feedback when you've got the team online together. You can give feedback about the whole team and how they're working together. And I think that would be a very good thing to do, assuming, of course, they are. But I don't think it's a good idea to be giving feedback to an individual when everyone else is in the room, even if it's positive. I'll tell you why. There are many people who are introvert who are absolutely terrified about being made the center of attention. And if you single people out online, albeit it's positive feedback, they may not appreciate that. So in other words, the feedback's lost and they feel awkward. Now, do you want to make people feel awkward, even when it's positive feedback? Isn't it just as effective, if not more effective, for you to give that feedback to them online in your one-on-ones? I think so. I know so. So, there's this old adage of, praise in public and criticize in private. I don't agree with that at all. I think the best advice that I can give you, working remotely, is all feedback should be in private, okay? Both positive and negative. Of course, if you have the whole team there and they're working well together, of course you need to give feedback about that. Or if the team's not working together, then I think it's very, very important for you to do that as well, okay? Now, the importance of critical incidents. Now, of course, you're not in the room with them at the time, but there are critical incidents that go on during the day. So there could be a phone call between, two people, or it could be another meeting that you didn't attend, or there's a whole bunch of things that can go on. Now, you need to be kept in the loop about these things, and you need to encourage people to keep you well informed. A lot of your team members don't think they should bug you about a lot of things, so they don't bother letting you know what's going on because they think you're too busy, or maybe the incident's not important enough, and that can be a problem. But if you are giving feedback to people, I think using critical incidents is very, very useful. So for example, if there was a real issue with a customer, and let's say that there was a miscommunication, breakdown of communication, and the customer got the wrong product, or whatever it might be, something along those lines, it was a disaster, and you're talking to your team about that, then you can use that critical incident to talk about what can be done better. And of course, as I said earlier, you wouldn't necessarily single anybody out during that meeting, but later on, you may decide to have a series of one-on-one meetings with those people in the team meeting, and you might talk to them about their role in all of that. Absolutely. And one of the most constructive questions that you can ask is there anything that you'd do differently if you'd had an opportunity to do this again? Great question, because the truth is the critical incident's gone, so it's no good jumping up and down about it. It's finished. It's the best thing you can do is fix it and then learn from it. So the key thing for you is to ask people what they will do differently faced with a similar situation. Now, remember that all feedback really is about the future. So when you're giving feedback, there's only two reasons for giving feedback. One of them is, of course, to change behavior for the future. So if someone does something a little silly, then you want to put a stop to that. Then the objective of your feedback there is to get the other person to modify their behavior for a similar incident in the future. Now, the other reason that you give feedback, which is positive feedback, is because you want to reinforce the value of that behavior, and you want that person to continually demonstrate that behavior for the future. Now, I raise this with you for the simple reason that a lot of people will wallow around in the past and talk about, he said this and she said that. Look, at the end of the day, you need to say to the other person, look, all I'm worried about is either this doesn't happen in the future again, or that I want this to happen in the future more. And so you've got to get your head around that, and you can stop people wallowing around in the past, because the past's gone. All you've got now is the present moment and the future. And that's what feedback's all about. Okay. Now, let's talk about some very specific things that you can do remotely. Now, I know, obviously, you're not there, at the kitchen table with them, or wherever they're working out of, or if it's another office. You're not physically there. And let's say that they've completed a project for you, whatever it might be, whether it's a recruitment project or whatever they've done. You don't know perhaps when they did it, as in the hours. You may not know how they did it. So there's a whole bunch of information that you don't know. So it really raises the question, how can I possibly give feedback if I don't know? Well, this is the way you do it. You use what the military would call an after-action review. Now, what you do is you ask the person 3 key questions. Now, this is ideal once a project's been finished. The first question that you ask the person is, what went well? Now, it might have been an absolute disaster. Right? Sometimes it could be just completely went off the rails, but there's always something that went well. So start with what we call an upward spiral of positivity, not a downward spiral of negativity. So the question for you is, the question for the other person is, what went well? And then bite your tongue until it bleeds and allow the other person to share with you what they thought went well. So, for example, if they say, oh, no, I don't think anything went well, I said, come on, there must have been something that went well. What was it? So hold the line on that and get them to admit what it was that went well. Now, once they've done that, your next question to them is, what could have been done better? So even if it was a huge success story and it looked on the surface as if everything was done absolutely perfectly, it still could have been done better. No question. Everything can be done better. So what could you have done better? And again, bite your tongue until it bleeds and allow the other person to share with you what they think could have been done better. All right. Now, what we've done is we've set up what went well and what could have been done better. The third question, and the reason this model is so wonderful is it's easy to remember, right? So the third question you ask is, what would you do differently next time? Magic question. What would you do differently next time? Don't be afraid to ask that. I want the other person to start thinking about those things. The only way I can get people to think about how they can improve their performance, of course, is by asking them the question of what would you do differently, or how would you improve next time? What would you do? I want an answer for that question because, let's say the other person says, oh, I don't really know. I haven't really thought about it. Just say, well, look, can you think about it for me? Because it's a really important question. And I'd like to follow it up with you next time we talk online. And then just make a mental note to follow up on that, because I want people to take complete accountability for their performance. And so do you. And the only way they're going to do that is obviously by pretty much giving their own feedback about their own performance. You see how that works? So the after action review is a wonderful way of being able to facilitate feedback when you're working remotely, because you're not there. It's not a reason not to worry about feedback. It's all the more reason to use this after action review. The only sort of stipulation about when you can use it is there's a kind of like a start and a finishing point on something. So it could be a report, project, it could be an interaction with a customer, whatever it might be. At the end of that, in other words, it implies after action review. So it happens after the event and you ask these 3 questions and it works extremely well. Okay. Now, the other thing I'd like to say before we wrap up here is you may have seen this model, but I think it's a wonderful model to explain learning. Now, when you and I or anyone goes through a process of learning anything, whether we realize it or not, we go through 4 stages of learning. And I'll just run through these with you, and I'll use the analogy of driving a motor vehicle because it's something that most of us are very familiar with. So if you look on the left-hand side, you've got this word unconsciously, or these words, unconsciously incompetent. Now, in plain English, what unconsciously incompetent means is that I don't know that I don't know. In other words, ignorant. So I know when I was 15 or 16 years old, quite a few years ago, I might say, unfortunately, but I knew when I was 15 or 16 years old that I could drive a car, that I thought my parents were hopeless drivers and I couldn't wait to get my license. And, you know, this whole idea of getting lessons and all the rest of it just seemed pointless to me because I was at the stage of unconsciously incompetent. In other words, I didn't know that I didn't know. And then one day my father asked me to reverse the car out of the garage, you know, just as a little bit of a test, if you like. And I thought, fine, you know, I got in the car, I turned the ignition on, and I put the car in reverse, and I put my foot on the accelerator, but I put my foot on the accelerator too heavily, and I zoomed out of that garage, and I forgot to take my foot off the accelerator and my foot on the brake. And what happened, unfortunately, is I ended up, you know, hitting the hedges at the back. Fortunately, there were hedges there. There was no damage done to the car. But at that point, when I'd hit those hedges, I all of a sudden moved to the second stage of learning, which is unconsciously, sorry, the second stage of learning is consciously incompetent, right? Consciously incompetent means I now know that I don't know. So all of a sudden I realized this driving cape is a little bit more difficult than I actually thought it was. So I'd actually moved into that space. Now, I did embark on some driving lessons, as most of us do. And, you know, I found that doing a reverse park and, you know, all the things you have to do and we take for granted now, I had to be consciously competent. So to get my license, I had to actually consciously competent means I have to concentrate in order to be able to, in this case, drive effectively. So after a while, of course, 10, 15, 20 years, you end up in the final stage there, which is unconsciously competent. In other words, you kind of just know to look in the rear vision mirror. Reverse parking, hopefully, is a little easier. You get an idea and a sense of what's going on. You don't have to be sort of giving it, you know, the 100% attention you would have when you were first learning to drive. All of us go through those 4 stages. And I think if you've got a young person that you're working with remotely, it's a useful model for you to think about that often a young person will come in the workplace, think they know everything. They're unconsciously incompetent. They will, you know, make a few mistakes in the early stages, and that puts them in that consciously incompetent phase. And then after a while, they start to learn how to do things right. So they're consciously competent. And hopefully after a while, through sheer habit and repetition, they become unconsciously competent, which is where you want people to be. So it's just worth thinking about that model. Now, a couple of things about conflict and difficult conversations online, because I understand that this is probably something that people find very uncomfortable. The first thing that's important is not to argue with people and to avoid confrontation. So let's say someone's a bit angry with you and on the phone or whatever, and they're just quite confrontational with you. Please don't take the bait and end up being confrontational with them, because once you get into that sort of situation, remember, you're the team leader, you have lost it. So there's two things you can try there. You can say to the other person, I agree, let's agree to disagree, which neutralizes the conflict. Or you can say to the other person, I refuse to argue with you about this. Either way, you're neutralizing the confrontation and the argument. Okay, so don't argue with people. It's not a good idea. You're not going to get anywhere. It's going to end up in tears if that happens, sometimes literally. Focus on people's performance and don't focus on them personally, but the whole idea is focus on their performance. That's the key thing. Be very careful of the words you use and don't make generalizations. As I said earlier, it's all being very specific. Always come back to the fact that this is all about shaping the future. So it's all about either reinforcing positive behavior, or in this case, which is going to be a more difficult conversation, it's about changing behavior for the future. Try to emphasize strengths as well as weaknesses. So obviously, if you make generalizations about someone absolute, like you can never get this right, that's not a good idea, because obviously you'll get people very defensive and they won't listen to you. So emphasize people's strengths. And this is critically important working remotely, is that you will often find that there are a whole bunch of factors involved in a situation that you weren't aware of. In other words, who was the person talking to? What did the other one say? So seek out the causes, seek them out and ask why, ask open-ended questions, try to get to the bottom of it so you understand it better. I think that's a really important bit of advice for you. And when you've got to have conversations about performance, a couple of things to be mindful of. Get straight to the point. So if you've booked an online call, or you've booked, that's probably how it'll go. Don't start by talking about their family. Don't start chit-chatting about what they're going to do on the weekend. Remember, these are the conversations where we're talking about poor performance. So we're not, so this, I know why you're doing it, because you think it'll put them at ease. But of course, in the back of their mind, they're just anxious to know what all this is about. So the longer you delay getting to the point, the more anxious they get. So you're doing the exact opposite of relaxing them. You're actually making them more anxious, if that makes sense. So get straight to the point. Say, look, the purpose of the call is, and then dive in and tell them what the purpose is. Explain the purpose of the meeting. Now, when you've done that, and I don't think there's anything wrong with writing down your answer. I think it's a good idea to write down your answer, actually, because, sorry, when I say write down your answer, what I mean is put the words down on paper. And this is one of the great things about working remotely is, of course, you can sort of write down exactly how you'd say something. And I don't necessarily think you should read it off, but you should certainly be able to refer to that. And then when you've done that, encourage the other person to speak. Right? So the whole objective at this stage is to get the other person to give their side of the story and to speak, and encourage them to speak. In fact, the longer they speak, the better. Now, of course, when they do speak to you, it might be that they start saying some provocative things. It might well be that they will, make accusations. They might have incorrect information. The key point for you is to bite your tongue until it bleeds. You must not, I repeat, you must not interrupt the person. Why? Because at the end, when they draw breath, you can then say to them, there's two things that I'd like to comment on that you just said. And then jump in and comment on them and correct them if you must. Now, if, of course, the other person starts interrupting you while you're talking, aren't you in the moral high ground then to say to the other person, look, I just gave you a chance to speak, so I appreciate the opportunity to speak without being interrupted. You see how that works? So 4 key principles: get straight to the point, explain the purpose of the meeting, encourage the person to talk, and bite your tongue until it bleeds. Okay, which brings us to the end. And your homework is to practice giving 3 positive bits of feedback every day for 2 weeks. There you are. I want you to actually consciously do that. You might say, well, why 3? Well, you can give more if you want, but 3 is a good number because you can manage 3. And I think that, you know, look, obviously the feedback's got to be positive. And my view about this, and I mentioned this in the first session when we were together, is just saying thank you to someone is positive feedback, right? Just say thanks. Just say thanks. I really appreciate the fact that you know, sorted that out with the customer. Because sometimes thank you, we don't get enough thank yous in the workplace. I don't, you don't, we don't, all don't, right? So what if you started to make it a habit of actually thanking people? It's the ultimate form of courtesy. And I think what you'll find is you'll get some incredibly interesting and good results out of that. So give it a shot. Just say thank you more often, and just find 3 opportunities every day. Now, today, of course, is Thursday. So tomorrow, so this afternoon, I'm asking you to start. And then I want you to continue tomorrow, have a nice weekend, and then come back on Monday and start again. I'll guarantee to you, you'll be shocked at the impact it'll have. Now, when I say positive feedback, I don't mean just making it up, right? I mean genuinely positive feedback. But give the feedback and you'll be quite pleasantly surprised at how well it works. All right, so that's the feedback. So folks, thank you for your time. We're done. I'll be sending you a copy of these slides and the video, hopefully this afternoon actually, and a link to the next session. And look forward to hearing your war stories. And have a great weekend. And don't forget to give your 3 bits of positive feedback. It's not hard. It'll make a difference. And I know you'll benefit, and so will your team members. Thanks, everyone, and see you next time. Thank you and goodbye.